Hello and welcome. My name is Sarah Timm, and I'm the Manager of Interpretation at Maine Maritime Museum in Bath, Maine. What this means is I work with a team to design and facilitate the museum's education programs and on-site interpretation of the museum's exhibits and historic shipyard for a broader audience. So when people hear Maritime Museum, they usually think ships and burly sailors, perhaps a knot-tying demonstration. While yes, this is a component of maritime history, at our museum we try to broaden the narrative and tell stories of Mainers and their relationship to the water through many perspectives. A common mantra at staff meetings is that being a maritime museum means that we're not a science museum or a history museum or an art museum. We have the luxury of being all three. So this is a long-winded way of introducing the topic of this talk: Sailors' Souvenirs, Cultural Appropriation Across the Ocean. Globalization is a really trendy word describing the process of creating a single shared culture. As we'll uncover in this talk, this is never entirely possible. As Americans, we may have a difficult time seeing this process, as many of our own homegrown cultural symbols that we're used to have reached a global recognition to a point that they've taken on their own cultural significance elsewhere, and we haven't even noticed, such as Coca-Cola, McDonald's, iPhones. That is why I was very excited when Diana Tweet, the CATS curator of modern and contemporary art here at Colby College Museum of Art, reached out to us about an upcoming exhibit they were working on. Hew Locke's body of work is laced with themes connected to globalization, points of cultural disconnect, and dissolved, lost, and reclaimed identities. Locke explores these themes and their repercussions by juxtaposing charged visual languages. Let's take hinterland, for example. Here, Queen Victoria stands steadfast as a symbol of British imperialism and an immovable reminder of Guyana's colonized history. Well, the joke is on Queen Victoria. After Guyana won national independence in 1966, the statue was moved from its politically significant location in front of the Victoria Law Courts in Guyana's capital of Georgetown to the decisively more passive location in the Botanical Gardens, left to the mercy of the local fauna. In Locke's image, ghostly traces of soldiers tapping their drums and skeletons are tooting their horns. Or are those figures even human? Are the skeletons trumpeting Victoria's imperial victory or her defeat? How you answer these questions really reveals the visual language in which you are most fluent, or in other words, how your culture has conditioned you to perceive the world around you. It is in this ambiguity of meaning that Locke defines himself as an individual and an artist caught between two worlds, British and Guyanese, imperial and colonized, homeland versus hinterland. His works invite you to read an image and decipher how your translation says much more about you than the object itself. And isn't this really how souvenirs work? Not to provide an objective cultural snapshot of where you traveled, but to serve as a subjective reminder of your own perception of a place, to let you buy and own a piece of that culture to do with what you will. Souvenirs are already fragmentary by nature, never really representing the whole of a place or people. They invite reinterpretation in order to fill the gaps of meaning that they left behind in their place of origin. Today, we're going to parse out this process by taking a close look at the objects brought home by Maine sea captains from the ports that they visited. Why were these objects chosen? And how did their meaning change as they made their journey across the ocean? In the 19th century, globalization was reaching a fever pitch. The Western world was experiencing the Industrial Revolution that saw an unprecedented demand for resources and goods. Maine had a significant part in fueling America's growing economy. This was the age before jumbo jets, before cargo ships. If you wanted to move goods, they traveled on wooden sailing ships. In 1856, Maine built the most vessels by far than any other state in the Union. Bath, known as the City of Ships, was second only to Boston in the number of vessels it constructed this same year. Maine shipyards built ships primarily for trade. The map you see here is a compilation of plotted coordinates from American ship logs from the 18th and 19th centuries. This is where Americans were going in the 1800s. Today we're going to focus on souvenirs brought back from Asia and the Caribbean. Just as in Hew Locke's work, the meanings of these objects are prismatic, constantly changing to reflect the cultural code in which it's viewed. First, I want to introduce Captain James Shotgun Murphy, who commanded the Bath-built four-masted ship Shenandoah, built in 1890, and at the time was the largest sailing vessel ever built in North America. Murphy was a hardened captain who came from a long line of captains. Local newspapers claimed he rounded Cape Horn, the very dangerous waters below South America, over 50 times to make repeated journeys to California and abroad. One such newspaper describes him as a contradictory character who loved the limelight of winning a race. He, quote, was a sound businessman with an eye to profit, while ready to risk them and his fortune to win a wager, a man with a sense of humor and a frightening lack of it. On one such sail to a Chinese port, Murphy bought this silk embroidered jacket, now featured in Maine Maritime Museum's garment collection. The detail of the embroidery is astounding. The jacket is lined with a white trim and floral motifs featuring many different types of bird species. The arms are lined with a bright fuchsia silk. Gold thread creates a vegetal background, dotted again with these various exotic birds. American merchants increasingly traded with Chinese ports after the end of the Opium Wars in the 1840s. By the late 19th century, Chinese aesthetics was a familiar style in American homes and fashion. Chinese motifs of birds and flowers fit well into the Victorian interest in the natural world. Ladies' fashion magazines provided a glossary of symbols that women could incorporate into their costume and embroidery. Between 1827 and 1923, there were over 98 published flower dictionaries in America. Water lilies, they represented moral purity. White roses equated to truth and love. So Murphy's silk jacket fits nicely into the American fashion scene of the late 19th century. But why did Shotgun Murphy, a man who lived much of his life on the sea, make such a purchase? Well, according to family accounts, Murphy bought this jacket as a gift to woo the daughter of a prominent shipbuilding family at home in Bath. The young captain was hoping the prestige that the silk jacket would lend himself would be enough to convince Miss Elizabeth Houghton that he was a viable suitor. The Houghton family was among the highest of Bath's social elite, accruing their wealth and status from their successful shipyard. We can see the Houghton family was well tuned to the Chinese-influenced fashions of the day. Their homestead in Bath, seen here, featured quinoa wallpapers inspired by the Chinese prints imported to America during this century. You can see here a sample of this wallpaper. White and black cranes walk among lily pads and other flora. The bottom left photo shows the room where this paper was installed in the Houghton mansion. But alas, it was not enough. Murphy did not win Miss Houghton's heart, nor the social prestige that would have come by marrying into the Houghton family. But we really haven't answered the question of why Murphy chose this specific object to win Elizabeth's favor. Let's think about it from Murphy's perspective. As a young and aspiring captain who had not yet won the gravitas and status he would later gain in life, he needed something that signified his skill and success. There was a hierarchy among the shipping industry. The wealth of ship owners and ship builders often outclassed those of ship captains. But ship captains also had their own hierarchy. Those who sailed transatlantic or trans-Pacific routes were a higher social status than captains sailing the coastal routes of the American East Coast. Captains that routinely rounded Cape Horn occupied the pinnacle of this social pyramid, and this is where Murphy found himself. For Shotgun Murphy, the silk jacket had little to do with wanting to remember his time visiting Chinese ports, or even Chinese culture at all, but rather was meant to signify his success as a deep-water captain, his knowledge of current American fashions, and his ability to afford such a garment. Asian clothing, or by extension costume, was a common marker of status among captains and their social circles. This next object from Maine Maritime Museum's collection, a watercolor by an anonymous Japanese artist, is a high watermark for cultural appropriation. Here, 3 white women stand casually wearing Japanese kimonos. The central figure, holding the paper umbrella called a wagasa, is Mary F. Gibbons, daughter of Thomas Patton Gibbons, captain of the ship John R. Kelly that transported case oil to Japanese ports. Her friends Christine Carter Snipe and Rose Stahl flank her either side. As the story goes, Captain Gibbons, while in port in Japan, commissioned a local artist to paint this portrait as a gift for his daughter. The artist rendered the women's features in watercolor using a photograph that Captain Gibbons had carried with him on his journey. The women wear a specific type of kimono called a furiosode, which are traditionally worn by young, unmarried Japanese women on very formal occasions. Likewise, a Japanese viewer would have a far deeper cultural understanding of the wagasa. For centuries, these oil paper umbrellas were a status symbol in Japan, taking months and many craftsmen to produce. By the 19th century, they were a common component of theater and geisha costume. These are Japanese cultural details likely lost on American viewers. I seriously doubt Captain Gibbons wished his daughter to be seen as an actress or even understood the cultural complexities of the geisha role in Japan. More likely, the geisha's costume to American eyes became a familiar and generalized symbol of Japanese culture as a whole. Port painters relied on the daily commissions from Western sailors searching for personalized souvenirs. Americans, like the rest of the world, rushed to Japanese ports as the market opened to Western merchants for the first time in over 200 years in 1854. Though this painting can be considered a unique work, the background scene and kimonos are likely stock imagery used for multiple customers. Think of the ready-made backgrounds in amusement park photo booths. This image reflects a broader trend of white women posing in Japanese costume among maritime social circles, evident in this photo. Remember the Houghton family, the prestigious shipbuilding family Shotgun Murphy tried to marry into? This is their family yacht, Juno. When we zoom into this photograph on the wall, what do we see? 3 women posing humorously in Japanese kimonos. It is curious to see that this photo has a bit of cloth pinned above it. We're uncertain as to the function of this cloth. Does the coquettish nature of the image paired with a cloth covering indicate a possible taboo image meant for a gentlemanly gathering? Or is it simply to protect the image from moisture? Either way, a comparison of the 2 images elicits interesting contrasts. The Houghton image, seen on the right, exudes a playful tone, a full acknowledgement of the silliness of 3 American white women wearing the costume of a far-off culture. The women knowingly trivialize a garment that has a long and complex tradition in its original Japanese context. In the Gibbons image, seen on the left, the 3 women stand stoically, suggesting a more serious tone, as if the costume lends an air of sophistication to the ladies. Well, if we step back, we can see how the watercolor was intended to do just that. Commissioned as a gift, the Gibbons portrait was likely intended to be displayed in the Gibbons home. During the Victorian period, the home was much a public space as it was private. Parlors were reserved for entertaining guests and a place to display your curiosities and souvenirs. Take this curio cabinet from a Victorian Bath home. The sole purpose of this piece of furniture is to display the family collection of figurines, vases, and other curiosities. So you can imagine, as Mary Gibbons welcomes guests into her home, her portrait served as quite the conversation piece. Why, yes, my father did commission this portrait while visiting Japan. The status of her father as a deep-water captain bolsters her own social standing. The portrait was an apt reminder of the success and wealth the family accrued in the seagoing industry. So again, we see how cultural appropriation, complex cultural details begin to lose their specificity and become indexed with new cultural meanings wholly separate from their original context. For variety's sake, I also want to discuss this chess set from Maine Maritime Museum's collection, because when you really think about how this object would function in an American home, it presents a picture that really encapsulates American perceptions of China and the Chinese. So first, a little bit of context. Americans welcomed Chinese products in their life, fashions, tea, kerosene. But the same cannot be said about the Chinese themselves. During this period in the late 1800s, Chinese immigration to America was growing rapidly, due in part to the railroad construction and the gold rush. Simultaneously, but not related, the American economy was slowing significantly. The Chinese became scapegoats, blamed for taking all the jobs and lowering the average American wage. Racism was rampant and blatant. You see here an advertisement for the magic washer, extolling the benefits of their product and eliminating the need for the Chinese, many of whom worked in the laundry business. The bottom of the advertisement reads, quote, "We have no use for them since we got this wonderful washer." In response to this growing hatred, the U.S. passed the Chinese Exclusion Act on May 6, 1882, that prohibited Chinese immigration to the country for 10 years. The act was continually renewed until it was made permanent in 1902. It was not repealed until 1942. Returning to the chess set, the design of this box imitates Chinese lacquer, an aesthetic style that became wildly popular throughout American homes in the 1800s. So while Americans were busy thinking of ways to rid themselves of the Chinese question, as the issue was called, they were hungry to own Chinese products. Like with any trade in luxury objects, two markets existed, one for authentic objects and one for knockoffs. This set likely sits somewhere in between. This idea of authenticity, especially in the 1800s, is complicated. What makes something authentic? The production of souvenirs to sell to Western sailors was a thriving industry in China and almost every global port. So in addition to the craftsmanship, deciphering what is authentic is largely related to the intent of the maker. Did this Chinese artisan produce this fine piece of furniture for furniture's sake, to be sold and owned by one of his peers? Or was it cheaply and quickly made for the tourist trade? Either way, it's Chinese made. Of course, a Chinese lacquered desk sitting in a Vanderbilt mansion is likely of much more quality than this small chess set, likely produced for the tourist trade. But isn't the effect the same? To show that you are aware and are a participant in current fashions. Here, the intent of the maker is no longer relevant. The object serves as a symbol of social status for the owner. Our chess set here is by no means cheap. We do have gold lacquer, and the chess pieces are carved of ivory and resin. but the designs are comparatively simple compared to what we would call an authentic Chinese lacquer chess set. The chess pieces themselves are members of the Chinese imperial court. When you compare our set to the one held at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, you can see that our set is not unique, but an example of what was a common motif that appealed to the Western tourists. What can be more appealing than owning the Chinese imperial court in your own home? When understood in the larger racist American context, we begin to see that American appropriation of Chinese culture was less about innocent fascination, but more aligned with the desire for control, ownership, and personal profit. Chinese cash swords represent a complete reversal of this dynamic. Here you see what we call a cash sword, because it's exactly that, a sword made out of coins. Cash swords do have a place in Chinese culture, primarily as talismans used in Taoist rituals. The coins themselves, seen here, are made of silver and copper, infusing an inherent value to the object outside of its ritualistic function. But after the end of the Opium Wars in the 1840s, Qing dynasty coinage experienced rapid inflation. The coins used in the sword would have been relatively worthless. But the tourist trade provided an opportunity to reap a profit off an eager Westerner wanting to take home an exotic souvenir. This specific sword was purchased by Captain Rufus Randall from Freeport, Maine. He captained the ship John Briggs, the largest ship launched in Freeport. Randall and his family lived at sea for 5 years straight and traveled to Hong Kong as part of his regular trade route. A lucrative knockoff trade sold these cash swords, hawking their talisman powers to sailors who faced a possible dangerous journey back home. Here, Chinese businesses, cognizant of Westerners' poor understanding of their own culture, saw an opportunity to profit off of their ignorance. Maine Maritime Museum also holds other Randall family souvenirs, such as these rice paper paintings. Undoubtedly produced for the tourist trade as well, the color and detail of these images is breathtaking, again complicating our modern notions of authenticity. The purchase and display of Asian souvenirs was omnipresent in Maritime Maine. A newspaper article describes Bath-based Captain Richard Quick's captain's quarters. Among the plush furniture and upright piano, the living room was decorated with Japanese prints. The function of these prints, not far off from the snow globes of today, an opportunity to own and display a piece of another's culture. For the last group of sailor souvenirs that we're going to discuss today, we need to leave China and travel to the Caribbean. Sailors' Valentines are a perfect example of objects with muddled authenticity. You can see here an example of a sailor Valentine from Maine Maritime Museum's collection. The most authentic sailor Valentines, according to historians and collectors, are those housed in octagonal wooden frames and feature geometric designs or wistful sayings spelled out in shells, such as "Forget-me-not" or "Ever thine." At one time, historians believed that mariners made seashell collages as gifts for their sweethearts back home, hence the name, Sailors' Valentines. The romantic origin of these objects was debunked when conservators discovered that the majority of these supposedly handmade Valentines all shared one thing in common: newsprint backing from the Caribbean island of Barbados. So, if these Valentines are not authentic expressions of love from lonely yet crafty sailors, then whose culture do they authentically represent? The overwhelming majority of sailor Valentines were purchased as travel souvenirs in the New Curiosity Shop in Bridgetown, Barbados in the 19th century. So do sailor Valentines represent authentic Barbadian culture? If only geography made it that easy. Barbados, and the Caribbean islands in general, was a hotbed of international trade during the 19th century. The new curiosity shop was managed by two English brothers, Benjamin Hines Belgrave and George Gordon Belgrave. An advertisement for their shop promotes the sale of marine specimens and native manufacturers in fancy work. The Belgrave brothers no doubt used the phrase native manufacturers to increase the exotic appeal of their wares to international sailors. Nevertheless, it's an apt description. The brothers relied on the local Barbadian artisans to produce the curiosities that stocked their store shelves. Sailors' valentines are not considered to be authentic to the culture of Barbados. Nevertheless, the high number of surviving examples in today's museums and antique stores indicates the vast number of these objects made by native manufacturers, as you say. So how do we classify the authenticity of sailor valentines? Are they from Barbados, but are not authentically Barbadian? Or are they an authentic example of English entrepreneurship? Or does authenticity lie more in the hands of the makers, the Barbadians themselves? As in most gray areas in history, the answer is most likely some combination of all of the above. Sailor valentines that are not octagonal further complicate this question of authenticity. The popularity of sailor valentines in the United States prompted many valentine variations in a prosperous knockoff industry. As we've seen, objects can be riddled with contradictions. Context in both time and place determines what they mean and how they mean. So by way of conclusion, let us consider Hew Locke's work titled Souvenir II, Edward VII in Masonic Regalia. Here you see a classical bust of the British king wearing an elaborate headdress made of foliage. Locke plays with the theme of inauthenticity by juxtaposing the stoic neoclassical bust with a headdress and mantle made from a palimpsest of gold coins, unbridled flora, and even a green lizard that brings forth imperialized views of colonized Guyana. This juxtaposition creates an almost absurd vision. Diana Tweet perceptively describes the headdress as bringing forth images of mock ruin and the barnacles that form on shipwrecks. The title, Souvenir, literally brings home the contradictions of imperialism. Here, the British royal wears for all to see what he truly desired as a souvenir from his colony, wealth and prestige. When portrayed through a visual language tinged with overt exoticism, the sculpture makes clear Guyana would always be the exotic other, the colonized, the culturally appropriated, never intended to be British. When set next to the Gibbons portrait, Locke's Souvenir II throws into perspective the ways in which cultural appropriation becomes cultural exploitation. I want to thank you all for listening to this talk, and I hope you found it insightful. I want to also thank Diana Tweet, Jordia Benjamin, and the Colby College Museum of Art staff for inviting me to give this talk. If you're interested to learn more about cultural appropriation in Maine's maritime history, I invite you to visit Maine Maritime Museum in Bath and check out our new exhibit titled Interwoven: Threads of Power in the Domestic Sphere. This exhibit brings together fiber arts from the 19th century and today in order to trace the threads of power and change in gender roles and social norms. You can find more information at mainmaritimemuseum.org. All the best, and many thanks for listening.